Hello, I'm Evan Reese, an Asia-Pacific analyst at Stratfor, and this podcast is being brought to you by Stratfor Worldview, the world's leading geopolitical intelligence platform. Individual, team, and enterprise memberships are available at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe.
It would be catastrophic for humanity as a whole if we have a massive war in space, almost at the same level as a nuclear war, because we are so dependent on these space constellations, we will lose basically all the advantages that we currently rely on for a high-tech modern economic world.
War continues to evolve, but not always in the ways that many of us think. Welcome to the Stratfor Podcast, focused on geopolitics and world affairs from Stratfor.com. I'm your host, Ben Sheen, and in this episode of the podcast, we delve into the evolution of war, from World War I through to today. Stratfor Senior Military Analyst Omar Lamrani and Military Analyst and Director of Analyst Operations Floyd join us to discuss the shifts in technology and tactics, as well as where current strategic thinking about how nations wage war is leading us next. Thanks for joining us. Omar, Paul, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So we're here to talk about the evolution of warfare post-World War II. Now, obviously, that is a huge topic, and we won't be able to cover absolutely all the angles here. But I figure let's have some fun with it. Let's look at some of the major developments by period and by technology, and let's look at some of the ways in which the face of warfare has changed over the last 60, 70 years. Paul, where's a good place to start on this?
Yeah, I should just also, we should tack on the fact that we should also, since we are Stratfor, looking forward as well with where we think it's going. So actually, I think Omar is the best person to start this. He's done an excellent job of sort of narrating this by time blocks. So Omar, why don't you take it off?
I would start this with going to World War I and just kind of a preface to this conversation, because that's the really big worldwide conflict that was in a mass industrial scale. And I think one of the things that's not commonly understood, a perception of World War I is often focused on the fact that the defense had the advantage, and that's why we had these massive numbers of futile attacks that led to massive casualties, because it took a long time for the generals to know what they're doing and to change track. One of the important aspects of World War I there that's forgotten is that there's actually been tremendous evolution in warfare in World War I. Artillery tactics, in particular, were developed in a massive scale, and that set the path forward in going into the next 100 years. Just to understand that in the crucible of conflict, there is going to be change, because there is going to be developments of weaponry, there's going to be development of tactics. So even in a conflict like World War I, which is often thought of as a stalemate, there's been tremendous developments. And of course, Ben, that's where the Brits came up with a tank and various other technological developments. So I think we can start from there and just progress in that direction going forward.
Yeah, I mean, you should jump in. I mean, the stalemate was broken at some point. So there was a reason there was a conclusion to that war in a relatively timely fashion, all considering. We started to see the prototype of combined arms actually be developed at this point. So using all these different types of weaponry and systems in conjunction with each other, you started to see that. You saw development of infantry tactics to deal with and actual fire maneuver at a smaller level. You saw coordinated artillery strikes with armor. And you also started to see light machine guns that could be mobile with infantry, so they actually could respond to heavy defensive fortifications. So all of that sort of combined at the same time to actually advance the war.
And I think the most interesting thing about these nascent technologies that really did emerge throughout World War I, the introduction of armor, aviation, radio communications, was how they continued to mature in the interwar years and then really come to fruition in World War II. And to this day, I'm a little aggrieved that, it was a couple of British officers who kind of wrote the first book on combined arms operations, and they were ignored by the British War Ministry. And then the Germans applied that principle to great effect in the opening stages of World War II.
I have a theory, but and I can't prove it, but basically it's because the Germans lost. And usually the loser is much more willing to adapt and break the system and go whole hog with something that's new and untested because they have lost, as opposed to the winner who, I would argue, tends to stay entrenched with the old ways, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, you guys both brought up really excellent points. The first one, in terms of the tactics that were developed in World War I, were very, very similar to the ones especially 1917s and 1918s, were very similar to the ones that were taken in World War II. The difference is that the technology in 1718 was not there to allow the blitzkrieg style lightning war that happened in the initial stages of World War II. And it took a couple of decades more for the tank to become a reliable machine and a fast machine. It took another couple of decades for those aircraft, which were already conducting bombing and close air support in 1918 of World War I and during the World War I conflict, for them to develop into what we saw with the German Stuka dive bomber. And it took especially one of the biggest revolutions that allowed for those tactics that were developed at the end of World War I to become those actually offensive operations in a devastating manner was the radio. The radio allowed the communications to allow this combined arms that Paul was talking about to become possible. Because before, you had to relay messages through the telephone or like these cumbersome wireless. Now you had a tank, each tank had its radio, and suddenly everything is possible in terms of communications. And with regards to your points, Paul, about the Germans adapting those tactics because they were losers, I think that's very, very credible, and we can look at the adversary, France, for the perfect example. So France learned the wrong lessons from World War I. They saw the conflict as a huge bloodshed, and they basically said never again. So when they went into World War II, they adopted a very defensive mindset. They put up this huge Maginot fortification line and sort of forgot that they were also at the forefront during World War I of developing those offensive tactics and that's offensive technology that was then adopted by the Germans in World War II to flank them and defeat them in 6 weeks during the Battle of France. So I think it's really interesting, again, how sometimes you learn these lessons and you forget them, and sometimes because you are the loser, you tend to apply these tactics and learn from them sometimes even more than the winner, because the winner goes back to the same mindset that they've already won, and they will just apply the same mechanisms to the next war and sort of learn in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting to see how the French doubled down on defense, and then the Germans just completely came in with a different tack and were wildly successful. And there were some other technologies as well the Germans developed, like you mentioned bombing, which with the advent of aviation in World War I, sort of started to come into its own. And we actually did a piece on Zeppelin attacks, flying across the English Channel, dropping bombs on Great Yarmouth. But the advent of long-range bombing as well, and then the ability to deliver ordnance and really attack an enemy's heartland and actually make a dent in their wartime industry was potent. But then again, having all these aircraft in the air and the development of radar, the Germans then went one step further to pioneering initially rockets and unmanned weapon systems that they could put into the air. And that led to a whole different evolution of warfare in a way.
Oh, yeah, actually, let me jump in there and sort of weave your points in there, Ben, with sort of something Omar said. I think it's really important. It's going to be a theme throughout this entire conversation, which is technology creating new capabilities for weapon systems and new opportunities to sort of weave all these things together in more combined arms and move fires out, extend fires range. When I say fires, I mean, of course, basically things that go boom, and it can be delivered by all sorts of different things. So it's a very general term. Basically, it's really about the relationship of tactics and doctrines that are adapted, and as technology advances capabilities and how they all weave together. And also, Omar, we actually really didn't let you finish kind of laying out these blocks and broads. So we've actually done the pre-thing to what we said we were going to talk about. So from World War II on, how would you characterize this real fast?
I would characterize 1945 to the early 1960s as largely the same conventional tactics and the conventional weaponry that existed in 1944-45, just beefed up. So for instance, in the Korean War, that was largely fought with World War II weapons. The North Koreans and Chinese had the T-34 tank. They had the Joseph Stalin tank. The Americans came with Pershings and Shermans. And of course, some of the jets that were becoming available in the late 1945, just improved versions of those were used, but still using Mustangs and Corsairs and familiar aircraft from World War II. Where the big change happened during that decade and a half, or 2 decades even, was really in the large focus on the nuclear arena. So you had this nuclear weapons came into being in 1945, as we know, and that was really such a shock that there was even this idea in the United States, for instance, that you can use the nuclear weapons in conventional battle, against armies, and therefore that would be an offset against superior forces of the enemy. So a lot of the investments, a lot of the focus there suddenly became the strategic bomber force in nuclear weapons, with the idea that even though the Soviets had more forces in Europe and more tanks, etc., more artillery, you can negate that through those nuclear weapons. It's only as we go to the next phase of this period of let's say from the late 1960s to the early 1980s, that largely changed. Number one, because of the Russians themselves developing these nuclear weapons, but also because there was a revolution in the conventional arena, in the conventional warfare, conventional tactics and technology. So that's usually called revolution in military affairs. We're talking about 1967. There was the first naval vessel sunk by an anti-ship missile. 1968 was the first use of laser-guided munitions by the Americans in Vietnam. And then, of course, during the same period, we had the first use of satellites communication, satellites reconnaissance. And then, of course, you also had the anti-tank guided missiles that were prominent, for instance, during the 1973 war between Israel and Egypt. So all of these technologies allowed the United States and the Russians to sort of focus again on the conventional arena and really to become the ability to, it's not just about massive numbers and industrial scale warfare, but it's also the ability to provide your forces with the weaponry at a conventional level to negate quantitatively superior forces arrayed against you.
So I'd like to focus on some of these things in a bit more detail before we kind of move then into the the modern era from the 90s onward. So we talk about obviously this development of this sort of nuclear strategic capability, and I think this almost goes in concert with some of the larger dynamic shifts we're seeing, on the global stage. This move from this sort of multipolar world with a lot of different, competing nations and their resources and armies to this sort of like more bipolar structure where you had, these large blocks that were able to like mobilize their resources into this new realm. So how did we begin to see the evolution of this nuclear strategic capability?
Well, we didn't at first, actually. And I think that's something it's really important to unpack from what Omar was saying, which is initially, like, this new class of weapons was envisioned as another conventional weapon, something we would use in conventional warfare, that, to his point, where the numerical superiority of the Soviet bloc could be countered by NATO and its allies through just these bigger, larger, angrier weapons that actually could offset that and do more damage. What's interesting is over this time, as the systems got more complicated, got further reach, and you started building these redundant capabilities where you could sort of take away basic build survivability into them. You had second strike capabilities, i.e. this is your strategic bombers that are offset. These are your underwater boomer platform submarines. These are your ICBMs that are placed, back deep in the heartland of these different states. I would argue then at that point you started to see nuclear combat kind of get separated from conventional warfare, and you sort of had a separate domain at this point. And it really moved from a tactical and operational. I mean, don't get me wrong, there have always been strategic weapons, but they sort of became less of tactical responsive weapon systems and became more of its own domain with its own strategic imperatives and sort of its own level of deterrence. It moved into that deterrence phase. And in some ways, you could see how once you sort of locked in this nuclear deterrence at this highest level, and yes, there are tactical nuclear weapons, but most people believe that using tactical nuclear weapons would draw you into a strategic nuclear conflict. And once that was sort of established and kind of locked in eventually, it kind of spurred the idea that, okay, now we need to have that underlying level of conventional conflict where we're sort of still building on World War II platforms really needs to be looked at and thought out again. How can we get that standoff advantage, or excuse me, that advantage against volume with our conventional weapon systems and take nuclear weapons off the table? And so how can we have conflict at a lower level without getting to that highest level of nuclear combat?
When NATO was arrayed against the Soviet Union on the Northern European plain, it was not just enough anymore to consider nuclear weapons as a decisive way to counter that. The United States started considering anti-tank guided missiles in a sophisticated fashion. You had the developments of attack helicopters that would rip up the Soviet armored formations. You had the developments of even up into the 1970s and 80s, developments of close air support like the A-10 that would be designed to blunt these armored spearheads. So its tactical nuclear weapons were still parts of that equation, but it was increasingly relying on this new revolution of technology, the precision-guided munitions that were coming into the picture to counter the larger numbers that at the time were believed the Soviets had.
So how much is conflict, either open conflicts or proxy conflicts, how much is conflict a driver to develop this technology? Because, towards the tail end of World War II, the Germans were getting pretty advanced rocket technology. They could fire a V2 and then using inertial guidance, drop it pretty much where they wanted to in London, right? And then that technology then fed into development of rockets for the space program, and that naturally trickled over into ballistic missiles. But, you mentioned a couple of key dates in Vietnam where there was, this technology was coming to fruition, and then you had a conflict in which to try out some of this new stuff.
Yeah, I think conflicts was a major driver of this technology from World War II, obviously being the most intense level of competition, and revolutionary weapons were being created every 6 months or so. But even through the Cold War, because of that competition, because of the very serious nature, even though it's never technically became a massive conventional or nuclear brawl, it still drove massive technological progress into the armaments realm. So, for instance, consider the evolution of surface-to-air missiles throughout that period, or jet fighters, or stealth that came into the picture in the 1980s. Nuclear submarines were developed at an extremely fast pace during that same period. And I think to contrast that, just look at post-1990s. I would say there was a bit of a lull in the pace of development, mostly because, first of all, you had that peace dividend, but it's also a focus on counterinsurgency. So when you have a focus of counterinsurgency, you start developing weapons that are catered towards that. I'm speaking specifically to the United States that took the lead on this. But others like China and Russia were playing catch up. And so, yes, conflict and national interests and the desire to stay abreast of your potential adversary definitely drives the pace of an invention of armaments and weapons.
Yeah, I would throw in there a couple of things. Like, first off, you never should look at arms development and sort of warfare overall development. Like, it's always evolving. There's no way that it's not developing. Humankind consistently is improving on different designs and everything else. I look at conflict as a massive accelerator. And because there's usually an existential sort of motivator there, obviously, which allows you to dump more resources into it. It allows you to go to your society and say, I need to put all of my brain power and all of my resources to being better at this thing, i.e. making war, so we can live or we can accomplish these goals. So usually what I would argue is most of these large conflicts were large accelerators because so much of the national just resources are being dumped in so many different ways, and basically close to total war when you're talking about the world wars. But even past that, and a lot of these other even more minor conflicts, all considering, you still see the same kind of pattern over and over again, which is you start to discover these things that become very effective. You've seen I think a great one for more, like the global war on terror, for example. Again, not an official, actual combat in the sense of a declared war, other than on this sort of vague concept of terror, but we started looking at things and found that ISR, specifically drones, are really, really effective at being a persistent thing during this conflict. And look how quickly America dumped so many resources into that, and you had drones just explode across the thing, and then you had armed drones, and now it's almost this sort of, it's accepted as just this thing of part of warfare now. It's sort of like this integration of ISR platforms and drones with sort of day-to-day actions with U.S. military troops, and so many other countries are adopting that. But as of these things were just weird sort of esoteric things going into 2001. They were sort of interesting kind of aside projects that people were working on that kind of were playing with. And then all of a sudden they went from being sort of these side kind of developed projects to being main frontline combatant units.
We'll get back to our conversation on the evolution of war and where that evolution is leading us next in just one moment. But if you find this conversation interesting, you should definitely explore our more in-depth analysis at Stratfor Worldview. There you'll find historical reflections on key conflicts, geopolitical analysis on current flashpoints today, and also forward-looking assessments on the future of warfare, from the development of supersonic weapons to the implications of space in the global arms race. If you're not already a Stratfor Worldview subscriber, you can register for free limited access to our analysis or subscribe for complete access to our 20-year archive of analysis and strategic forecasting. You can learn more about individual, team, and enterprise level access at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe. Now, back to our conversation about the evolution of war with Stratfor's Omar Lamrani and Paul Floyd.
There is constant development, but there's also a cost to, unless you're in a total war and then you're throwing resources at essentially everything, like World War II. Generally, what you're doing is you're throwing resources and development into areas that you think are going to be the most necessary or the most useful to you against your adversary. So I think this brings us to the current day, and really to talk about something that's really important going forward is how the United States has focused on on equipment and tactics and training that's really conducive to this war on terror, war against non-state actors, insurgencies, terrorist groups, etc. And that has really given about a decade to 2 decades to major powers and great powers like China and Russia to really try to catch up. And so we've seen them put major resources, and with the growing economy of China and with the resurgence of Russia to a certain point, they have been able to get close to a certain point. And so this is where we can tie it to the rest of the conversation that we've already had, in the sense that the United States is now considering a third offset. And this is particularly the case with the previous administration, Bob Work. He tried to push this, but it's not, the terminology is kind of gone, but it's still very much there. It's the idea that in the 1950s you had the nuclear capabilities as an offset against Soviet armor and Soviet conventional quantitative superiority. And then you had the 1970s and 80s, you had the revolution in military affairs. That's considered the second offset. Again, technology in the conventional sense to provide you that qualitative edge to go against the quantitative superiority of the enemy. And now you have this recognition by the United States that the Russians and the Chinese are catching up, and there's a need for a third offset. So the third offset that we're looking at right now, and it's uncertain how it's going to play in the future and who's going to win this race, but it's things like AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnology, all these things that take what we have already learned from the revolution in military affairs and really elevate it to the next level with these new emerging technologies, including hypersonics and all of that. So that's the new race here. And it's really uncertain who's going to win, because while the United States could really crush the Russians in this competition in the 80s because they're much bigger, and NATO as a whole, much bigger economies that could devote a lot of resources to this technology and the development of it, we have for the first time in a long, long time, a country like China whose economy is basically a peer or nearly a peer of that of the United States. So in terms of being able to pour those resources and the necessary technologies, this is a different type of threats that the United States faced in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was always at a negative or at a disadvantage in terms of that, having that capability to pour resources into these technologies. Now China appears to be able to. So that's the big question going forward. Who's going to win this race amongst economically equivalent powers?
Well, and the one part of this is the U.S. is a huge head start. But to Omar's point, the U.S. has been very distracted at some level, focusing on the global war on terror, and has not been thinking about peer-to-peer conflict as much. And that's sort of been a sideshow. And if you look at sort of all the major platforms, when you think of aircraft, and you think of armor and everything else, there's just not a lot of new platforms that are coming out that are strategic level platforms that are designed, there's been almost a decade lull and really kind of pushing that where you could fight a near-peer competitor. But some other things to Omar's, I think it's worth thinking about, is some of the things in the global war on terror actually very much do feed into this third offset. And that's sort of looking at our space-based infrastructure, i.e. our satellites, our continued evolution of sort of sensors, sensor platforms, communication platforms, and ability to sort of have a truly global monitoring and communication network that really the U.S. is peerless in. So our ability to basically put somebody in landlocked Afghanistan halfway across the world, and I put by somebody I mean an army, and leave it there for 17 years, and have it be supplied and have it be able to get ordnance consistently and bring fires down in disproportionate amount of power for the amount of people actually on the ground is already a start in that direction. And now, to Omar's point, it's just who can start to layer on all these advanced technologies that are rapidly coming on board to kind of get that next, I would say, serious jump in capability platforms that really can increase that distance of fire's projection.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's also important to note that, the US has had certain distractions, and the US does have certain natural advantages. But China, it's hungry, it's up and coming, and it has this incredible ability to kind of mobilize its population and its resources to support a common effort. And they really have set the bar very high for what they expect of the Chinese military. And again, relating to how these new technologies such as, AI, hypersonics, nanotechnology, composites, materials and stuff, the US has the advantage of Silicon Valley and this very advanced, R&D capacity and leading the forefront of a lot of the electronic revolution. But again, we've seen China make huge leaps in this direction, and also they're willing to do things that some Western companies simply aren't. Like they don't have the same, they don't hold IP in the same sort of sacrosanct nature that a lot of Western companies do, and will almost willing to subvert the system. And again, they have this ability to scale in a way that few other countries can. So it seems like they are increasingly a credible contender to the US military dominance.
That threat, or that's a credible contender to U.S. military dominance, is becoming more apparent to the United States, and that could end up driving the United States to focus more resources and attention to the issue to stay ahead. So the trend line over the last 20 years has been China catching up, and that's easier to do when you're far behind because those technologies are already developed. But now we're getting close to a point, let's say in the next 10 to 15 years, where China is going to have to create its own technology. It's going to have to develop its own new weaponry that's completely devoid from the path already trodden. So in that sense, that's I think is where the United States could have an advantage, is that it's going to become more difficult for China to develop forward compared to what it has over the last 2 decades been trying to do. And the United States is also, secondly, going to be more aware of the threat and focus more attention on the great power competition and the peer-to-peer conflicts rather than the non-state actor threat. And I think those are the two advantages that could keep the United States ahead potentially going forward.
And like Paul said, experience counts in this matter.
Yeah, and I think it's actually really, I mean, when we talk about Chinese catching up and eroding U.S. military dominance, that's still very much in a regionalized sort of way. And I mean that in the sense that China is developing platforms that can beat our defensive networks, that can actually reach out and strike U.S. platforms. They can sink an aircraft carrier with a relatively, much cheaper missile sets in many instances. And so our ability to project power into China's regional area is becoming very much diminished, and that is very much taking the biggest hit in this sort of catch up or this gap shrinkage, if you will. The next big step for China and the huge investment, I think their biggest catch up is their ability to project power, their ability to have a space-based global reach network system of satellites and systems that all do the things that the U.S. does right now. They're not there yet, and they're touching them. They're developing them, but we're talking about trillions of dollars of investment over years to really start to kind of be in parity with the U.S. on this, for example. Now they know this to a certain degree, and to be fair, they are developing systems that can actually screw with our space-based infrastructure. They have anti-sat capabilities that can actually start to mess up one of our biggest single advantages. And there's sort of a disproportionate disadvantage for the United States right now because they don't have space-based infrastructure and we do. That's something that can really cripple us and actually take the legs out from underneath us in any kind of conflict right now. And so it's kind of a weird mixed bag here. But point being, though, that China has an advantage if it talks about fighting in its own neighborhood. Its ability to start going toe-to-toe with the United States when you talk about conflict across the globe, very much different. I think that's where the gap is the largest, if you will.
And on the space question, I think there's a really interesting point in that direction as well, is that the Chinese are catching up with the United States and sending up these satellites and creating these constellations. But the more they do so, and the more they catch up to the United States and create the same type of network, the less likely it is that they would attack the United States space assets, or to rephrase that, the more damaging it is to them to do so, because they are putting the same type of vulnerability up in space that the United States has. So if you think the Chinese are really good at intercepting satellites and destroying them, well, the United States is even better. So if the Chinese get to that point where they have that constellation in space, they are creating the same type of vulnerability that the United States has. So they are going to think really hard in a decade or 15 years when they will have that same type of constellation, whether it is worth it for them to attack that space asset, because they are basically, as they're evolving, becoming similarly dependent on having that infrastructure as the United States is now, except that, obviously they're more focused on the regional scope rather than the global scope like the United States.
Yeah, that's a great point, Omar, because basically, in my mind, you're creating, satellites are going in conceptually in the same way nuclear weapons are going, which is you either create mutually assured destruction specifically on these assets, or you create deterrence. So you kind of have almost basically just parity. So no one really gets the advantage in this case from here on out. But then that begs the question, we're not the only people that know this, and a lot of really smart people on both sides are looking at this and saying, well, if we want to try and win, how do we build, are there other systems that can be non-space based that are more defensible? Can we create redundancy in satellites to make them a lot cheaper and much, much harder to shoot down in the hundreds or thousands? So there's basically have a redundancy in these space-based networks. So that's sort of the future as we look forward, is basically everyone's looking at this and saying, yeah, this is where part of this arms race is going to be. It's frankly going to be in space, even if it's not weapons in space per se. It's things that facilitate weapons on Earth. and they're very, very important. And how do you defend them or create deterrence around them? Or how do you fight without them and actually still be just as maybe part of the next big offset is actually learning to get past space-based infrastructure and be, from your own territory, being able to monitor, have sensor platforms that can allow you to shoot and kill the enemy.
Yeah, well, actually, to those 2 points, the United States is actively working and ahead of China in developing microsatellites, which the idea that's it's shoot them up into space. They're cheap. You use them for the time necessary, and then it's okay if you lose them because they're not very expensive. So that's ability to, even if you lose your constellation in an emergency, you just pump out these microsatellites into space, and then they're good enough for what you need. That's one way. And then for getting away from space completely, if you really have to, there's also developments of high-flying drones that can act as a relay station. So almost at the orbital level, and then they basically have these satellite-like payloads that can relay back navigation or information. Obviously, nowhere near the same level as in accuracy and sophistication as a constellation of satellites in space, but enough to do the job again. But again, I think it's also similar to the nuclear deterrence thing in another sense. So there's also the massive economic damage, and just it would be catastrophic for humanity as a whole if we have a massive war in space. Almost at the same level as a nuclear war, because we are so dependent on these space constellations that if we're talking about the aspects of this getting hot and then you have a massive conflagration in space, we will lose basically all the advantages that we currently rely on for a high-tech modern economic world. So very much similar to what we were talking about earlier with regards to nuclear deterrence. We're getting to a paradigm where it's the ability to hurt each other equally, and by hurting the other person, you're also hurting yourself, because obviously there's space debris and all of that. So that's why I think another aspect of this is the various efforts to develop space treaties. So we already have the Outer Space Treaty and attempt to build up on that. So that's, I think, is another interesting thing that will develop over the next decade to 2 decades.
What I find fascinating about this is this seems to be this continuation of a trend we've seen for eons. I pick up a stick and hit you with it, you're going to find a bigger stick and take a swing. And it goes through, and then technologies come along, and at first they're prohibitively expensive or unwieldy, or simply you can't use them in the right way. But then this cost to entry eventually comes down, and you see this evolution of measure and countermeasure, and we go back and forth, and weapons become increasingly destructive. When you look at like dynamite was the game-changing explosive, and it was thought to completely subvert the way that wars would be fought and become so dangerous no one would ever want to use it. Didn't happen. And again, nuclear weapons now are almost like, it's a given, yet there's this other thing that could be far more deadly. So it's interesting when you play it forward to see, what's going to be put in place to protect ourselves.
Call me a cynic, but I never underestimate humans' capacity to find a way to wage war, even if that means, we won't fight with these because that'll kill everybody, but we'll use this other thing. Like, we'll find a way to keep fighting one way or another, to your point. And I think it's also worth sort of stepping back and sort of why are we so focused on satellites? I think the big point that I always sort of articulate with people when I think about what is the modern day sort of evolution in military affairs look like, and what is that, what are these offsets, what are we talking about? The best way to think of it is when we talk about fires, when we talk about artillery, when we talk about bombs that can be dropped, missiles, whatever goes boom. The most interesting thing that I've observed, both being in the military and sort of now basically working and studying the military, is like how much that's being pushed down to lower and lower levels. So you think about World War II, you had army divisions who were calling for small artillery assets and basically access to certain types of bombing groups that could kind of do these really broad sort of supporting large macro scale sort of supporting efforts and coordination. And then, of course, you sort of start getting like basically, the Stukas, the close air support for armor and for troops. But that was still on like divisional levels, army levels. And now you're looking at like platoons. You're looking at like, special operations with like 12-man groups that are rolling into countries and leveraging strategic assets from CONUS. And I'm by continental United States is when I say CONUS. So I'm thinking of like when we saw Green Berets roll into Afghanistan in 2001 that are bringing strategic level assets over to them and supporting them, and they're disproportionately fighting. And that's the trend line that I think it's worth thinking about when that's why we're looking at space, because all that space-based infrastructure is what supports that. That's where you communicate. That's how you call back home and say, this is where I am, this is what I'm looking at, this is what I need you to shoot, and everything gets coordinated around that. That trend line is going to continue. And so it's very interesting to be thinking about, does the future soldier basically become a JTAC, a Joint Terminal Attack Controller, basically a guy who doesn't really shoot his weapon that much other than for defensive purposes, but has to find the enemy, look at them and say, bring the weapons here. And it's about bringing fires from on high.
You're absolutely right. That ability to have a strategic effect on the tactical level near instantaneously. And when I say effect, we typically think, like you say, things that go boom. But when you consider again, the future cyber realm, there's a huge amount you can do to achieve an effect on target. And there's, when you consider the myriad ways in which you can do that, we're almost entering the realms of science fiction.
Well, it becomes that. And conversely, when you have the single guy or asset that can bring so much firepower if it can see you and kill you, that's, again, part of that cyber is severing that link. If I can compute, like with cyber, sever that link and make sure he can't call back home and they can't see me with their digital assets and shoot me, I've also won. So another thing to be thinking about, and that's why cyber has also become such an important component of this.
And also cryptographics as well. If you can sever that link from a drone to its like base control station, then you're going to lose control of that asset. And that's why a lot of the communications and the crypto related to that is so carefully and closely guarded.
This raises a really interesting topic, which is basically since modern warfare evolved as parts of an industrial-based aspects of human civilization, there is this concept of a short war because it's so deadly, so potent that there's no ability to continue waging that war for a long period of time. I mean, obviously, we've seen that prior to World War I. We've seen that after World War I, but it was disproven, obviously, in World War I and disproven again in World War II. So what about now? We are talking about the ability by small forces to wage unimaginable damage. And of course, I'm not even referring to nuclear weapons here. I'm just talking about the conventional realm through cyber, through calling in airstrikes, through and long-range strikes. You don't even have to get close to a port to level it. You can level it from all the way back in another continent. And also, if you layer into this the much longer periods of time that it is taking to develop weapons and to produce them just because they're so sophisticated. What does this really do to the duration of conflicts? I mean, on one level, you have all these things that point towards this war in modern terms, peer-to-peer, being so destructive that one side will essentially be destroyed in a short duration. But on the other hand, we have all the weights of historical evidence that people always tend to think that there's going to be a short war due to the lethality of conflict, but people find a way to continue going. I think that's an interesting idea to mull in terms of what there is in the future when it comes to a significant peer-to-peer conflict.
I guess the part that always concerns me about all of this is that there's an assumption that, along sort of this idea that like people talk about the short war, they also talk about wars will only be fought by sort of robots and at long distances in the future and everything else. But the fact is, the most important component in all these things is always humans and their ingenuity and sort of the infrastructure and the nation states and the industrialized nation states that sort of support that entire ability. And so it's a bad assumption to ever think that we'll get to a place where we're having robot wars and that someone won't go, I need to look at the place where these robots are coming from and the humans who are designing them and not kill them. That will always be a huge concern. And so it's a fallacy to think that wars will ever be completely short, and it's a fallacy to think that wars will never have humans be a main casualty of them.
Well, that seems a good place to end on, though I fear you've left it open for a podcast grading movies and literature on their accuracy when it comes to military technology, but maybe for another time. Paul, Omar, thank you so much for joining me today on this podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Stratfor Podcast. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please stop by our forum section at Stratfor Worldview or send us an email with your thoughts and ideas on the topic. You can email us at podcast@stratfor.com. We'll also include some links to related analysis in the show notes to get the conversation started. And if you're not already a Stratfor Worldview member, you can sign up for our free newsletter or learn more about complete access to our analysis and strategic forecasting through individual, team, and enterprise subscriptions at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe. And for more geopolitical intelligence, analysis, and forecasting that reveal the underlying significance and future implications of emerging world events, follow us on Twitter @Stratfor.